Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're listening. Welcome back to AI and the Future of Work. Thanks again for making this one of the most downloaded podcasts about the future of work. If you enjoy what we do, please like, comment, and share in your favorite podcast app, and we will keep sharing great conversations. This is your host, Dan Turchin, advisor at Insight Finder, the system of intelligence for IT operations, and CEO of PeopleRain, the AI platform for IT and HR employee service. Now, we've been inundated with 2022 predictions over the past month or so, but one set stood out for me as being both insightful and provocative, I'd say above all the rest. Today, we get to discuss not just the future of work, but specifically what's ahead for the next 12 months in areas as diverse as blockchains, security, venture capital, and even causal inference. Imagine that. Dave Kellogg's a serial CEO, advisor, investor, and what I call the SaaS whisperer. He recently joined Baldrige Capital as an executive in residence. Dave's illustrious career has spanned exec stints at iconic companies like Host Analytics, Salesforce, MarkLogic, and even Business Objects before it was acquired by SAP. Among other accolades, Dave's SaaStr talks routinely rank in the top few most watched. Dave owns two dubious distinctions. In over 100 episodes that we've recorded, Dave's one of only 3 repeat guests on this podcast. He's also the biggest Grateful Dead fan I know. And look, I'm just going to say, I assure you the two aren't directly correlated, but perhaps loosely correlated. Without further ado, it's really my pleasure to welcome my friend Dave Kellogg back to the podcast. Dave, welcome back. Why don't you share a little bit about what you've been doing over the last year or so since we last had you on?
Super. Well, thanks for having me, Dan. Great to be back. Did not know I was in the rarefied air of repeat guests. So thanks for having me. In the past year, I've been doing more of the same, really, advising and consulting, board work, angel investing. I think the new thing you mentioned in the past year was signing up as an executive in residence at Baldrige Capital. They're based in London, so I got to go over there in the fall, right before Omicron. And it's been a very fun gig to get started and work with some of the folks at Baldrige, both friends, both old and new, let's say.
Dave, I refer to you as the SaaS whisperer. You've recorded a lot of your talks about SaaS metrics, and I know one of the predictions in your 2022 Kellogg blog post was about some of the metrics that you think are going to become higher profile for SaaS companies this year. Maybe let's start off with talk a little bit about what's up ahead in the way of SaaS metrics.
Sure. So I think, for the last couple of years, I think I've been a big better on net dollar retention, also known as net revenue retention, for the simple reason that I think it's a far better way to value the installed base of a SaaS company than churn. I think churn is too gameable. I think I make a little quadrant of 4 different churn metrics you can report, and you're never really sure which one we're talking about. Whereas NRR and NDR is far less gameable. And I think it's just a better way, kind of from first principles, a better way of valuing the install base of a SaaS company, which is really what people are trying to do. So that's probably the biggest change over the last few years. That's why the SaaStr talk, I think it was last year or the year before, was churn is dead, long live NRR. Because I really believe that, and that's been one of my more accurate predictions, right? You're seeing more and more about net dollar retention, and less about churn, and less about customer lifetime value.
So you're a legendary enterprise marketer. A lot of us in enterprise software are struggling to connect with customers. It's really hard to get engagement when our tools became fairly blunt in a work from home world when we don't have the same opportunities to interact and build rapport, particularly if you're, let's say, a disruptor as opposed to an incumbent. It's harder to build relationships. Any advice from a marketing perspective for entrepreneurs looking to improve engagement with prospects?
Sure. I mean, obviously, and I was doing an interim gig running marketing at a $50 million SaaS company when COVID hit. Part of the things I do, I don't do them very often, is interim assignments. So I got to live firsthand through like reallocating the entire events budget over to digital, right? And events in an enterprise software company are often like a good chunk of the budget. So I think obviously COVID forced us to embrace digital anything from content marketing strategies to SEO and SEM improvements to kind of content syndication. Obviously, what's the big one I'm missing? Well, obviously to webinars, the whole thing, anything you could do online became basically the only thing you could do. And you lost live events, both big and small, trade shows, conferences. So that was probably the big reallocation. We tried to replicate a lot of those events virtually, like a virtual wine tasting and a virtual cooking class. They're good for small exec events. You can do that. Still not quite the same. There's software packages that let you have private rooms and trade show floors, and you can emulate some of that. We did a virtual user conference very quickly. A lot of people do that now. Overall, if I just had to pick one piece of advice for an entrepreneur, it's a book on marketing written by a guy who sells swimming pools, and it's called They Ask, You Answer. And it was about how he transformed his swimming pool business by just producing good content that answered questions people had, like what are the trade-offs between a fiberglass and a concrete pool, right? And he wrote, rather than writing kind of classical marketing content that nobody really wants to read, right? He wrote genuine, like, I make concrete pools for a living. I'll tell you the trade-offs. If you're right for a concrete pool, buy this. If you're not, you should look at fiberglass. And he literally built a big business by simply producing more and more content that tapped into the questions people were asking and answering them. So particularly for an early stage startup, as you're trying to figure out your content strategy, why not just try and make the world's best FAQ for your category, right? And put it online.
2 years into the pandemic, would you say that there are any technologies that have enabled remote work and even potentially remote engagement from a marketing perspective that are now mainstream, that have been introduced and mainstreamed on an accelerated rate because of the pandemic, but that a couple of years ago just didn't exist?
Trying to think, I can think of a lot of examples of acceleration, obviously video conferencing and such. I can't think of entirely new things, right? I mean, Slack, video conferencing, these things are all part of our day-to-day life. Hopin, certainly for doing live events online, that would be a new one kind of driven by the pandemic. But I may be drawing a blank on other, at least marketing technologies. To me, it was all about acceleration, right? I mean, this is more broadly, but I still love the little joke meme that said, what drove digital transformation in your company, right? CIO, CEO, COVID-19. And I think COVID-19 drove digital transformation of the entire business, from supply chain to marketing and everything in between. So, but I can't think, I'm sure I'll think of five when we're done with the podcast, Dan, but I can't think of anyone. To me, it was all about accelerating stuff that was out there.
Yeah, virtual event platforms like Hopin are very easy to use and certainly cost effective versus live events for vendors. But I found that engagement has waned over the last, say, 18 months. First of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, will there ever be a time when a virtual event will be as compelling or as effective as a live event?
So look, I'm a longtime enterprise marketing person, so I like live events. I think live events are particularly important for startups. Like if you're selling to a vertical and they have an association, or you're selling to CFOs and there's a CFO club, right? Those kind of early opportunities to meet in small venues, the right contact is incredibly important. So I'm a kind of small live events person for startups. Big events, trade shows, conferences, people like those. People go to those. I went to SaaStr. That was great. He spent $300,000 testing everyone, right? So to get into SaaStr, you needed to get an antigen test before they let you in there. It was the first time since COVID hit that I was at an event where I felt like it was all pre-Omicron. I could kind of let my guard down, right? Because I was vaccinated, everyone was tested, and it was fun. I have to say, it was great to do that. By the way, the event was also largely outdoors, right? It was kind of indoor, outdoor, and venue. So I think, will events come back? Yes, I do believe they will. Has anything replaced them with the engagement level? No. I think, look, the biggest learning I took from all this, Dan, was don't pave cow paths, right? That was a popular expression back in Bubble 1.0, right? Where they're saying, hey, we have this new technology. Let's not just pave over the cow path because the cow path was meant for the cows. Maybe we should put the road somewhere else. And I've always liked that metaphor. And I think the way to do digital events wrong is to pave a cow path. Keep the same session structure, keep the same day structure, right? You could take the agenda for the online event, for the physical event, and move it online without changing. And I think that's a big mistake. So I think the real question is, how do you reinvent the event for the digital platform? And I'll give you a simple internal operational example. I was running QBRs, and for me, a QBR used to be a 3-day, 2 or 3 day live meeting, big dinner, everyone just grinding it out. Part of it was an endurance test, right? Like get there at 8 in the morning. And if you're fading by 6, you're weak, back in the day, we'd go till 8, and you'd push it really hard. But digital forced me to change that. By the way, I ran them I ran a full QBR in 2 or 3 days, 3-hour sessions. I literally cut the meeting back by well more than half, and I thought it was just as productive, maybe more productive. So I think that was, to me, the opportunity on this stuff. Reinvent. Don't just pave over. And I think the more you pave, the more engagement's going to suffer, the more it's not going to work.
So you've teamed up with Balderton, a venture firm based in London. But prior to that, you spent most of your career in and around the venture ecosystem in Silicon Valley. What should entrepreneurs know about the difference in the cultures of venture outside of the United States, or even outside of Silicon Valley?
Well, that's a big question. I think, let me contrast it, Dan, because I've always been a bit of I grew up in New York City, not New York City, New York City suburbs. And I came out here to go to college in California. But I've always been a city person, and I've always been more of an East Coast person. I was kind of a reluctant Silicon Valley resident. Like, I was here for the work because you had to be here for the work back in those days. So when I had a chance, like, I worked for Silicon Valley companies in New York City for a while. Anytime I was given the chance to go somewhere else and work for a Silicon Valley company, I did, including 5 years in Paris at Business Objects. So my first 5 years at Business Objects were in Paris. And at the time, I can say the venture scene was totally different in Europe than here. That first, there just wasn't much of it. Second, the terms were horrible, big dilution, bad terms, participating preferences, all those stuff you could think of as just bad was the only way you could get money over there. Even the mentality was different. Entrepreneurs wanted to have a large piece of a small pie. Like, when I was living in France, a typical French entrepreneur would literally rather own 80% of a $20 million business, right, than 5% of a $200 million business. And the last thing, and this was a big deal in France, I can't say it was true across Europe, but I've always viewed failure in Silicon Valley as kind of the red badge of courage. If you remember that book you probably read in high school, right? That, hey, it's okay. I have a red badge of courage. I was at a failed startup. It's been good for me, character building, arguably. And in Europe, that was not true. And that, to me, there were two big differences between Silicon Valley and Europe in my experience. One was failure was a stigma, not a kind of, a stripe or a badge of courage, right? Time served. The other was the two, what were they? It was the stigma of failure and the lack of a regenerative ecosystem, meaning, in English, that everybody who made money at Business Objects left France. And everybody who makes money in Silicon Valley becomes a venture capitalist, does another startup, becomes board member, becomes an advisor. And that was a thing that I watched as I moved out of Paris around year 2000. It was just sad because we had a lot of people in Europe. We had who knew how to build a European business that attacked the US market and succeeded. And it all kind of dissipated. People had good careers. Some retired. Some moved into venture capital, but not in France, right? And that's changed now. I could say that the European VC has now started to catch on big time. And we're now in that second generation where you have repeat founders, where you have founders who've been successful starting funds, becoming advisors, becoming scouts, becoming angels. So that's like super exciting to watch because that, to me, is almost like the second stage booster of the rocket. So I've always loved Europe and been working over there. So when I got in touch with Balderton, I was happy to do this. And the biggest thing I was happy to see was, wow, it now regenerates because it didn't used to.
Are the soaring valuations from Silicon Valley permeating the rest of the world, or is more of the conservative approach in Europe permeating into Silicon Valley?
I think definitely more the former than the latter. I don't know. I mean, I don't really know how global the VC market, was 5 years ago. Like, I don't think if you were in London, you could raise money from a Sand Hill Road firm that easily. Now, of course, they're all starting London offices. So a lot of them have dropped down offices in London or other European cities. So now you can argue that the market for startup capital is more globalized. But I always thought there was kind of an arbitrage play. Like 15 years ago, I was like, hey, I should start companies in Europe, move them to the US, and do the arbitrage play between the two different. I think that arb plays a lot less now. I'm not an expert on this one because I haven't looked at that many deals. I do more operational advising, to be frank. But everything I read and hear says European valuations have come up. They're probably not at the same level as US, but they're definitely come up. And I don't think that arb opportunity works anymore.
So by your own admission, you got about 70% hit rate for your 2021 predictions, which I think is pretty good, solidly better than a passing grade. And those were some pretty ambitious predictions. So now we look at your 2022 predictions. And one of the sections that I thought was thought-provoking was your section on Web3. And one of the sub-themes was, I'm going to paraphrase here, but blockchains are the enterprise data store that nobody needs. Talk a little bit about your thoughts about blockchains and use cases in the enterprise.
Sure. So first, that 70% was on my admittedly self-charitable scoring scale, but yeah, it was a pretty good year for my predictions. Web3 and blockchain. Let's go straight to blockchain. I've kind of always felt this way about blockchain. And as a reminder, Dan, I'm a database guy from way back. Like, I was using relational databases in 1983 at Lawrence Berkeley Lab when I was an undergraduate at Berkeley. And my first job was tech support for relational database in 1985. So I've been using databases for a long time. After leaving that job, I worked at an object database company, then went to Business Objects, where we sold kind of a light multidimensional database. I ran MarkLogic, which was an XML database. I was on the board of Aster Data, which is one of the original big data databases. I could probably find some other database stuff I've done, but I'm a database person. And I've worked a lot with both general purpose and special purpose databases. And my overwhelming theory is special purpose databases are a good thing, but people always seem to want to over apply them. Like, for example, the multidimensional database. So one way I characterize databases is what's their data model. So in a hierarchical database, it's a hierarchy. In a network database, it's a network. In a relational database, it's a table. In a object database, it was typically a C++ class structure, right? That was the kind of, what did it model? In an XML database, it's an XML document. In a graph database, it's a graph. In a time series database, it's a time series, right? Every database has this notion of kind of fundamental modeling unit. And then you take stuff that isn't that and you try and map it in, right? Like, you could build a table in XML, and I could store, the employee in the department table in XML documents. Good luck running a join. You're going to do the world's slowest join, right? Because it doesn't understand the data structure of a join optimizer. So I think, as somebody who's been into specialized databases as well as general purpose databases, whenever I see a special purpose database, I say, what was it built for? And the odds are it's really good at that, right? Like, I always say, if programmers got to pick what kind of databases we'd use, we'd all be using object databases, right? Because they have no impedance mismatch between the programming language and the database, right? So when I first looked at blockchain and I read the Satoshi Bitcoin paper and started learning about this stuff, I was like, oh, for this use case, this makes a ton of sense. And then what happens in Silicon Valley too often, in my opinion, is people get excited. Sand Hill Road gets excited. Technologists gets excited. And they start saying, look at all the other things we could do with this. And look, a big part of Silicon Valley is exactly that bridging process. Facebook bridging from college students to university students to humans to the whole world, right? This notion of systematic build is a very important part of what makes Silicon Valley great. But it gets over applied sometimes because people will look at blockchain and go, oh, it's got 100 enterprise uses. And I've always been like, why does the enterprise need blockchain? Why do I need a public, slow database? And I don't, that's not ACID or base. I just don't understand. And the answer is, if you want to build Bitcoin, it's a great use case. But I've always felt like other use cases were to use the famous quote, technology in search of a business problem. right? They'd say, oh, I have this really cool technology and blockchain is cool. And then say, let's go apply it to other problems. And they kind of search for problems to go solve. And I just think that's the wrong way to do things, right? Somebody who wants to advise companies in technology, tell me about your problem, go find a technology built to solve that problem. And frankly, the further your use case gets from why they built it, the less you should buy it, right? Like, tell me what you were thinking. It's always the first question for any founders. Where were you working and what were you thinking when you invented this thing? Because I'm betting that if you're good, that it's going to be really good at that thing. And then we need to see how well it generalizes. And I just think blockchain got so much hype around it that people just started to try and, kind of pushing on a string, just like, oh, use blockchain for this, blockchain for that. And if you look at blockchain, it's a public database. All data is public. I mean, you could build a private blockchain, but by default, it's public. It's deliberately slow, right? I'm building a database that has basically a linked list structure that runs slow on purpose. Like, I'm slowing it down through proof of work. And proof of work, the best metaphor I heard for proof of work the other day was when airlines fly empty planes to hold their gate slots. So we tweeted that proof of work. So it's not just slow or inefficient, it's deliberately wasteful, right? To slow down the system. And it's immutable, which is probably its biggest strength, right? That's awesome, but the consensus algorithms behind it are quite wasteful. So I just don't think. I mean, enterprises are almost the exact opposite of that use case, right? We have our own databases, we have our own security infrastructure, we have our own IT. We are a central thing. Like, we have a CEO, we have a CIO. So I think my enterprise blockchain argument is, I have trouble finding low trust enterprise use cases. Like, tell me the problem again. That, like relational data. Well, all databases were basically originally built to do transactions, right? Databases are really good at transactions, right? I mean, the debit credit benchmark was a banking checking transfer, right? I mean, that's what we do here. So if you're going to tell me you're going to do that better and by making it slower and distributed and decentralized, I don't understand it. I think, look, I do believe there are some enterprise use cases. If you look really hard, you can find something other than Pablum. By the way, most of the time, if you just type enterprise blockchain, terrible testament to the state of search today, but it's Pablum. I was at a slide this morning that was just junk. And it's actually quite hard to find intelligent writing about enterprise blockchain use cases. I'm sure they exist, but to me, the pattern it's setting off in my mind is cool technology. Everyone got excited, and everyone's trying to apply it to do things that was never really built for.
So you pulled kind of an emperor's got no clothes on Web3, which I've been thinking about a lot. And you said basically kind of the whole thesis around decentralization inevitably needs to, in order for the vision of decentralization to be realized, you're essentially going to need these centralized platforms to harden Web3. It's a little bit controversial in Silicon Valley. Talk about why you think centralization is going to essentially be required for developers to, or for users to start trusting the vision of a decentralized Web3.
So I think a couple of things. I mean, first, my favorite part of that part of the post is the links. I have some links to what I think are really awesome articles. Tim O'Reilly's post, probably the most balanced of the lot, is fantastic. I have a Grady Booch tweet that's pretty funny that I'm linking to. After the initial publication of the article, I found another Web3 source by Moxie Marlinghouse, but called First Impressions of Web3. I've now added that and linked that in. It is a phenomenal work. So the first thing I'd say is, if you're interested in Web3, I spent a lot of time finding those links. Go read the stuff at those links. Consider it a curated link collection of good stuff to read on Web3. Now, to the question of centralization, my basic prediction is Web3 is going to deliver a lot of cool stuff, but it probably will not deliver decentralization. But like so many things in technology, it will accidentally deliver a lot of other cool things. but the actual thing we're setting out to achieve, if you believe that, is decentralization. I'm not sure it happens, and here's why. One of my little theories is the lower you are in the stack, the more the world wants standards, right? That I want there to be one standard for how to read a CD-ROM, or back in the day, a tape, right? I want there to be one standard for, well, I don't know, for USB. Well, there's multiple USB standards, but I'd like to be able to have a standard USB port and a standard USB device. I don't even want to make decisions about those things as a buyer, right? So to me, the lower level you are on the stack, databases being a great example, operating systems being a good example, right? The world doesn't like entropy at low layers of the stack. The world likes standardization. CIOs like standardization at the low level of the stack, right? I once met the CIO back in the day of GE, and he basically, in not so many words, said, "My job is standardization of infrastructure." And it was, right? Because there's so much by default, right? So much stuff can creep into your stack and make it so chaotic that as a CIO, you're basically a defender of the stack. And the lower in the stack, the more you need defense, right? You need to say, no, we're standardizing on this version of Red Hat Linux, or we're going to use Windows, or we're going to use whatever. But it's going to be very important that we standardize. So I think that's what's hurting Web3, which is it does a really good job of decentralizing kind of the internal operations of the database. But if you want to call this database, as Moxie Monaco's pointed out in his article, you're going to call it through some APIs. And now those APIs become, and by the way, the world wants standardization at that layer, right? You want programmers who know how to use those APIs. So I just think there are these kind of irresistible forces that drive us to standards. The best example I saw was, if you read the Morninghouse First Impressions on Web3 post, he built 2D apps, one called Autonomous Art, where anyone can mint an NFT, the other one called First Derivative, where he basically creates a kind of tracking stock for a popular NFT, and OpenSea banned it. So if I go on Rarible, I bought one. If I go on Rarible, I can see it, whereas OpenSea has said, no, that's a copy, because it's basically the same NFT, so we're going to block it. So it's still on the Ethereum blockchain. If I went into an Ethereum block explorer, I could find my NFT, my first derivative. But if you're going to access the Ethereum blockchain the way most people do, you're going to go through OpenSea, and OpenSea is blocking it at their API. It doesn't exist for all practical purposes. So here we are, we're centralized again. And by the way, all these curated collections, and by the way, all the scamming on Discord. I mean, one of the more disturbing things about Web.3 is the number of people who, like, my apes are all gone. There's a famous tweet where literally someone DMs you something, you connect your wallet to it, and your apes are all gone. And by the way, each ape today sells for a minimum of $300,000. So if somebody's losing apes, you're talking about a lot of money. So, and you see over and over, I just tweeted this morning, a woman that had been scammed trying to buy, I think they're called cyber girls. And it happens a lot. So we want, and to some level, yeah, welcome to the Wild West, and be careful who you accept a DM from, right? And now we want OpenSea's security team and MetaMask security team trying to protect us from those people. What is that? Centralization, right? So I think the dream of decentralization is actually not what people want. I think people like NFTs. I actually like NFTs. I think it's kind of a cool idea to create scarcity and collectability. I think NFTs are kind of cool. I think there's a lot of crap NFTs out there, but NFTs are cool. But do I really? But I buy them all through OpenSea, right, or Rarible, right? And there's our middle. One of my favorite tweets was Anshu Sharma, founder of Skyflow. You may know him. He's like, if you don't need intermediaries, why is Coinbase worth $50 billion again? So it's like, yeah, we do need the intermediaries. And yeah, I have an NFT that's on the blockchain, but for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist anymore because OpenSea doesn't like it. So, and I'm okay with that, to be honest, because it's not going to make me, not want to buy on OpenSea. So I just think it's ultimately, if you want to invoke these services, you're going to go through some API. And the argument is, look, let me do the counter argument. The counter argument is, yeah, but the blockchain is public. Somebody else could build one that shows your NFT, Dave, that OpenSea is choosing to hide. And that's true. But in Silicon Valley, law of increasing returns, even just in consumer marketing in general, yes, I suppose it's theoretically possible put it this way, it's not theoretically possible to disrupt Facebook, right? Their data is in their databases. They own it, right? I guess you could disrupt them, but you can't they own their data. You're never getting the data. Whereas the difference here would be the data is public. That's a public blockchain. Anyone can read it. and you could see it. So there are some differences, but I think they're practically speaking moot, frankly.
So this creates a ton of cognitive dissonance in the Web3 community. And because we're talking about predictions, let's say a year from now, we're sitting here and we're having another version of this conversation. And are the Web3 pioneers going to mutiny when it becomes clear that there's consolidation around a small number of centralized platforms? Your OpenSea and Rarible examples are great ones. How does the community, is that organism going to reject the antibody?
Yeah, I don't know. I don't have a prediction of what they do about all this. I'm sure. Look, my basic belief is all this stuff gets overhyped. Web 2.0 was overhyped. If we want to go back in time. By the way, I also linked to Tim O'Reilly's original Web 2.0 paper. Fantastic paper to go reread right now to get a feeling for what it felt like before. This same sense of hype and confusion and what's real and what's not. Because a lot of people were anti-Web 2.0, right? And no, the notion of my favorite definition of Web 1.0 versus 2.0 was read only versus read write, right? There was a blog called the Read Write Web. And it was kind of a technical way of looking at it, but that's what social media was, right? It was a read write web. I could tweet, I could blog, I could do a lot of things without having to kind of run my own web server to go build a blog. I could just use a service. I could just use Twitter to do microblogging, as it was initially called. So I think it's good to go read that paper to get historical perspective. And I think if that cycle repeats itself, what happens is there's basically some of it ends up being empty hype. I have a feeling decentralization it might end up more empty hype than reality, but a lot of good things will come of it. A lot of good apps came out of Web 2.0. I just don't think it's going to solve. Look, it all depends what you're looking for Web3 to do, and because that's the other point, right? If you want to create this decentralized, idyllic world, then it probably won't do that. But just, and then one of the reasons I go use all these things, Dan, is to get a reminder of that. Discord is literally terrifying. I'm afraid to press any link in Discord. Like the first thing they tell you to do in Discord is disable DMs. Like if you want to keep your NFTs, disable DMs. So I guess it's great that it's decentralized, right? Code is law. There is no intermediary. But holy cow, maybe intermediaries aren't such a bad thing when you lose all your apes. Like if my Bank of America account just showed up with zero balance in it, I could call B of A and start legal proceedings to get my stuff back. In fact, one of the more cold-hearted responses to the "I lost my apes" guy, I don't know if you saw this one on Twitter, is somebody saying, "Why does your profile pic have an ape you no longer own?" Oh man, that's cold. So I don't know. I don't think in the end, I don't think there's as much. I don't think people want decentralization. I think people like cryptocurrencies. I think people like NFTs, and I see a bold future or a bright future for those things. But I think it's kind of, what it might be like? Semantic web. Remember when Web 2.0 was happening, the next level beyond that was semantic web with the original web inventor. I can't remember his name right now.
Tim Berners-Lee.
Yeah, thank you. Sir, Tim Berners-Lee, I believe pushing the semantic web vision. Semantic web didn't happen. RDF didn't happen. OWL didn't happen. Ontology web. Okay, it happened a little bit, but basically macro, it didn't happen. But we got a rewrite web. That's kind of what I think will happen here. We're not going to get decentralization that they want, just like we won't get semantic web, but we are going to get a lot of cool stuff, including cryptocurrencies, NFTs. I'm sure I'm leaving some stuff out, but that stuff's going to happen.
One of the things we talk about a lot on this show is building public trust in AI, and specifically who owns your data. And when AI is making decisions based on your data, what rights do you have to understand how those decisions were made? And that's what intrigued me about one of your predictions about moving beyond, or to increase trust in AI, again, paraphrasing, and moving to a world where we expect more what you call causal inference. So with respect to, the 11 months left in 2022, it seems so bold that something as foundational as causal inference will start to permeate or infiltrate how AI-based decisions are made. Do you really think that we're going to make that much progress in 11 months?
Sure. And I'm not even sure these are only AI-based decisions. These can actually be human decisions as well. So let me go back for a minute here to one of my favorite lines is, again, I'm going to show my age, but in The Graduate, a 1970 something movie with Dustin Hoffman, one of the dads grabs him at the swimming pool and goes, "Plastics. I have one word for you, plastics. And the future is going to be plastics." Pretty ironic now when you think about the situation. I guess he was right at one level, judging by the oceans. But in any case, I've always liked that scene where an older person goes to a younger person and says, "I have one word for you." And for at least the last 10 years, and I started this a long time ago, it was data science. And here's the thing about this prediction. My meta prediction is for the next 5 years, it will be causal inference will be one of my predictions, just like data science was. If you look at my predictions, ever since I've been making them, one of them has always had something to do with data science. In fact, this year one still does, which is Bachelor of Data Science is the new MBA is the prediction this year. But I do feel like causal inference is the new plastics, using my metaphor. And I think it's very, very early. I don't think it's going to change a lot in 2022, to be honest. But it's one of these predictions that I'm predicting I'm going to make every year for the next 5 years, 10 years, and causal inference is going to enter the mainstream vocabulary. One of the things I try to do in my prediction, Dan, as well, is try to make some that are relatively obvious extrapolations of current trends. Usually the last one is kind of the not always, but often the last one is kind of the craziest one or the most visionary one. And therefore, it's in my mind, it's actually on something of a different time frame. But I do believe, if I can dig into the prediction itself, that, I'll just pick the example I use in the post, but I was at a meeting one time and somebody said, well, I've been analyzing our churn and, I don't know, 50% of the customers who churned, of the big customers who churned in the last year, had filed more than 5 severity 1 calls with tech support. And then followed by basically, God damn it, we need to do something about reducing the number of severity 1 calls. And you hear that all the time, and that statement will go unchallenged in most business meetings. People will be like, righteous, yeah, let's go do that, word. and it's like, wait a minute, like, no. I mean, what else do those companies have in common other than they filed 5 support calls? And by the way, this is an old blog post I did called "You Can't Analyze Churn by Analyzing Churn." Which is, if all you're looking at is the people who churned, you're never going to be able to differentiate what separated those who churned from those that didn't. The whole premise is analytically flawed to go look for common patterns in those who churned, when the question you're trying to answer is the other question, which is what differentiates those who churned from what didn't. And then the even deeper question, which is, okay, what does separate those two groups? Was it causal? Is it just correlation, right? Does the windmill turn because of the wind? Or does the wind blow because the windmill's turning? To pick a silly example that we all intuitively know the answer to, right? But still, if you were from another planet and you landed on Earth and saw a windmill turning, you would have to think for a minute about what's cause and what's effect.
So I got to get us to a stopping point, but not without asking one drill down on that. How do we know when we're there? What does it look like when we're making decisions where we've fully diagnosed the root cause? Such an elegant prediction, and yet so hard to measure.
Yeah, so I think, to me, the measures can be pretty simple. Frankly, when your company has a causal inference team, I think that'll be the first sign. Just like when your company had a data science team, we had analysts long before we had data science teams. They were just called analysts, and maybe they worked in finance, or maybe there was an ops guy on an ops team or an ops gal, but the manifestation will be, and look, I've got an inside track here, Dan. My son is a PhD in behavioral economics and works on the causal inference team at Google. So this is where I got the idea. And I started to learn about causal inference. And just like you said, the first thing we're all taught is correlation is not causation, right? Everybody knows that. But what do we actually do with that knowledge? Nothing. So we all know it, we all believe it, and then we go to a business meeting and we say all the customers who churn have blue eyes. Let's not go get any more blue-eyed customers, right? And it's what, right? Like, we're not applying and interpreting the data. So, and even data science teams can fall victim to this, because they're most of the tools we have today are modeling tools, and the models are effectively some sort of regression. And they're just saying what things move together, right? They're not saying what moves what. And the difference, look, the fundamental, so to answer your question, there is an easy answer to your question, which is when you have a causal inference team, and basically when the data scientists and MBA analysts get stuck and they say, we need the causal guys, then or gals, then you'll know that we need the causal team, and we'll go in there and work with them. That'll be the easy way to detect it. The other thing, hopefully, you'll start to see in meetings is that people are going to be more attentive to the fact that these two things are correlated, but potentially not causal. And just think awareness, right? Like, just how did data science happen? This, to me, it's just going to be a replay on data science, which, by the way, great irony. That itself is kind of inferring cause invalidly. So this is the first thing my son saw when he read the post. He's like, you do see the irony here. It's like, yes, I see it. I was wondering how fast you'd see it. Because I said, if this basically repeats like data science did, this is what's going to happen, which is on what basis would you assume it would repeat? And I don't really have one, but let's just say, without getting too much in the weeds, if it does repeat in a similar fashion to data science, you're going to first hear about it, hear it's possible. People are going to start hiring PhD level people to do it. They're going to start getting big insights. We'll hear those stories. People will start majoring it as a degree. It will become a job. Or data scientist literally wasn't a job 15 years ago, right? Like, so that's what I'm thinking is going to happen. That's why this is a long-term prediction, that now that we've gotten so good at basically regression and correlation models, people are going to start to say what's actually causing what. And when you know you're doing that, is basically, well, one of two ways. You're running a randomized controlled trial, right? You have to run an experiment. If you really want to do causality, you need an experiment. That's the easiest way to do it, and that's what pharmaceutical does with drug trials and stuff. A double-blind randomized controlled trial. That's an experiment you run to determine cause. This year's, to give you an idea of how far out this may be, this year's Nobel Prize was given in economics. It was economics? I can't remember. But the Nobel Prize in something, I think it was economics. The Nobel Prize in economics was given to people who figured out how to basically get causal inference off observational data, i.e. without running an experiment, because there are issues in public policy where you can't run an experiment. Or morally, ethically, practically, you just can't run an experiment. So they figured out a way, if you have enough data, to just use observational data to get valid causality inferred, basically. So is this stuff kind of big and hard? Yes, experiments aren't that hard. By the way, we can run experiments now. Thank goodness in today's internet, we can run a lot, and Google and all the big tech guys run lots of experiments, right? We'll give you this and not give it to you. So now I have a control group. We can watch 1,000 users and how they proceed differently, where one had the feature and one didn't. If I hold everything else constant and have a kind of random selection for who goes in which group, that's a pretty good experiment to tell me something. The really cool thing is that you can also do it when you can't run the experiment. So long story short, I'm a kind of a noob at this theory, as you can probably tell, or at this area. And I'm trying to learn more about it. That's why I put it into predictions, because I'm excited about it for the simple reason that we talked about. Everybody knows that correlation and causation, that correlation does not imply causation, but we say that and then move on and act as if it does. And I think over the next 10 or 15 years, that's going to change. And I think that's super exciting. And that's why I'm saying causal inference is kind of the new plastics.
I think we have to have a true expert come on this show in the form of your son to talk to us about applications of true rigorous causal inference and build on some of these themes.
Sure, be happy to connect you to him or his teammates. Yeah, it's a super interesting area, right? I mean, as soon as I heard it, I was interested in it. I was like, what are you going to do with Google again? And it's like, oh, wow, that's really cool. I mean, it was like, same with data science. As soon as I heard it, I'm like, oh, that's cool.
Very germane. Very germane. It's the future of data science. It's the future of enterprise data. It's the future of consumer data. Love it. Well, Dave, we've gone way over time, as we always do, but this was too good to cut short. And I'm not going to let you off the hot seat without answering one other question. And for some reason, I don't believe this appeared in your in your set of predictions. If 2021 were a Grateful Dead song, what would it have been? And more importantly, if 2022 were a Dead song, what would it be when we're looking back on it in 2023?
So this is an exceedingly difficult question, but I'm going to go with Stella Blue for 2021. All the years gone by, they melt into a dream, which is kind of what 2021 felt like. 2022, I'm going to be optimistic and say trucking. I hope it's the year we get back trucking on and start to move forward out of the pandemic, because it's now getting. I have a friend who's got a 4-year-old kid, and it's like half their life has been in the pandemic mode, right? More than that. It started to be a big chunk of people's lives, right? And it's I hope we can get back trucking on. So I'm going to go with Stella Blue for 21 and trucking for 22.
Dave, as long as it's not Monkey and the Engineer for 2022, I'll be happy. Good stuff. Well, Dave, as always, just a pleasure speaking with you. I think we only covered probably about 5% of what's in your predictions, but hopefully we'll have more time to discuss some of the others. And more important, when you have you back next year, we'll be able to rate how you did.
Okay, good. Well, it's great talking to you, Dan. It's always a pleasure.
Dave Kellogg talking to us about his predictions for 2022. I'll make a point of linking to all of the posts that Dave referenced, not just the predictions. Go out and read them. Go out and follow Dave. He's at Kellblog on the Twitter. You'll be hearing more from him very soon. This is your host of AI and the Future of Work, Dan Turchin, signing off for this week. But we're back next week with another fascinating guest.